In the spring of 1997, 19-year-old Russell Ford stood in a salvage lot outside Huron, South Dakota, with mud up to his ankles, faded coveralls darkened with old grease, and cracked gloves that had been stitched twice at the thumbs. The lot smelled like wet steel and diesel, and at the back fence sat a Farmall M that had not run in 8 years, its rear tires split, paint gone chalky, seat pan rusted through. Russell asked what the yard wanted for it. Glenn Tabor, then a rising dealership salesman, visiting the lot for trade inventory, looked him over once, glanced at the tractor, and laughed in the open way people laugh when they think reality is settled. Glenn wore a pressed logo jacket, clean jeans, and polished boots that still held showroom shine. He told the yard owner, loud enough for everyone under the awning to hear, that the kid would spend more in aspirin than the machine was worth. The yard owner named a price anyway, $150. Russell pulled out 350s from a paper envelope and counted them flat against a wet fender. By itself, that was a small moment. In farm country, small moments become philosophy if the arithmetic is honest. Russell hauled the Farmall home behind a 1981 Chevrolet half-ton with 312,000 miles, rust patched on both rocker panels with riveted sheet metal, and a passenger door that only opened from inside if you lifted and pulled at the same time. He rebuilt the tractor at night in an unheated shed lit by one hanging bulb, while daylight hours were spent working other people's fields for $7.25 per hour. Over 11 weeks, he spent $486 on gaskets, bearings, seals, and a used magneto pulled from another M in Mitchell. He wrote every purchase in a school notebook, not rounded numbers, exact numbers. $38.27 for gasket material and copper spray, $112.40 for bearings, $89 for the magneto core, $19.75 for carburetor cleaner, wire brushes, and emery cloth. The notebook had no poetry in it, only columns. That habit came from earlier years when nobody was watching. Russell grew up 12 miles east of town on rented ground his father never owned, and he watched what monthly notes did to proud men when weather and prices stopped cooperating. In 1992, when Russell was 14, a neighbor named Harold Vane lost 320 acres after 2 dry years and a renewal that moved from 8.4% to 11.2%. Russell stood by a livestock trailer at the auction and saw Harold hold his hat with both hands while machinery sold for less than loan balances. No one mocked Harold. He had worked hard, paid on time for years, and expanded when lenders and dealers said expansion was prudent. He simply ran out of room when rates rose and corn failed to cover fixed obligations. Russell did not speak much on the drive home that day. He learned that debt is not merely a tool. Debt is a timing bet, and timing is often outside a farmer's control. Ed Bjerke, who farmed adjoining sections and noticed quiet things, gave Russell his first serious chance at 16. Weekend repair work, fence lines, and spring tillage support at $6.50 per hour plus supper. Ed was not theatrical about advice. He would hand Russell a part, point to a broken casting, and ask one question: paid for or promised to the bank? Russell absorbed the pattern. Ed owned less machinery than neighbors with similar acres, but what he owned was maintained with precision and used until replacement had clear math behind it. In 1996, Ed sold an old grain drill at auction for $220 and told Russell afterward that a cheap tool paid in cash can outperform expensive confidence paid in installments. Russell remembered that sentence better than anything from school. Before he turned 19, he had already started a rule system that remained intact when other things changed. Every dollar of wage income was split into 3 envelopes on Friday night. 60% went to land savings, 30% to repair reserve, 10% to living costs. If living costs ran high, he cut costs. He did not raid savings. His annual living budget in 1997 was $5,940. Rent to his aunt for a basement room and utilities, $150 a month, total $1,800. Food, mostly bulk staples and venison, $1,400 to $20. Fuel, $1,060. Work clothes and boots, $390. Truck insurance and tags, $610. Church and family gifts, $320. The remaining $340 stayed as cash buffer. He did not have cable. He did not have restaurant habits. He had a ledger, a socket set, and the Farmall waking up one subsystem at a time. When the Farmall finally fired, it did not sound triumphant. It sounded steady. That steadiness mattered. Russell started custom baling and light tillage jobs that older operators did not want. Billing modest rates, collecting small checks, and splitting each check with the same 60-30-10 discipline. In 1998, his gross side income reached $18,740. After fuel, twine, and parts, net was $11,960. He moved $7,176 into land savings, $3,588 into reserve, and kept $1,196 for personal spending already capped by his budget. By December of that year, he had $19,430 in combined savings and reserve accounts and no operating note. By the summer of 1999, county extension meetings and equipment representatives were pushing a single message with polished certainty: scale or die. New tractor packages started at $68,400. Combines at $142,000. Variable rate financing opened at 6.2%, with annual resets buried in page 3. On paper, one offer looked manageable at $1,148 per month for the first period. The stress came later, where optimistic assumptions hid. Glenn Tabor made Russell his favorite public example, perhaps because Russell looked the part of an easy correction. At one meeting in a machine shed outside Woolsey, Glenn tapped a brochure and said, "You cannot farm serious acres with museum iron and cash envelopes." Heads turned toward Russell's table. Russell answered with 8 words: "I can farm what I can keep." That sentence later became a marker in county memory, the point where local certainty began to erode and the prevailing consensus started to crack. Russell did not refuse growth. He refused fragile growth. Instead of signing Glenn's zero-down package, he went to 3 farm auctions in 5 weeks and bought implements that looked rough but were mechanically sound: a field cultivator for $640, a grain drill for $410, a disc for $525, and a used bale wagon for $700 to $25, total $2,300. He paired those with a revived Farmall and then made one larger move: a used 1974 John Deere 443, purchased for $9,800 cash from an estate sale where tires were good and engine hours were documented at $7,140. He spent another $1,260 on hoses, fluids, and injector service, all recorded. The financed option would have required a minimum of $13,776 per year in early payments before resets. Russell redirected that avoided payment stream into a money market account paying 4.1% adding principal every month. By his 25th birthday, that account held $41,700. Neighbors still read his appearance and concluded hardship. He kept driving the same Chevrolet, now with primer spots over fresh rust treatment and a seat spring that clicked at every stop sign. His jackets were patched at the elbows. His boots were mended, not replaced until soles failed. At the elevator scale house, someone called him the poor Ford boy and meant no cruelty, only local shorthand. The underlying tension never disappeared. Public image said one thing, private balance sheet said another. Russell never corrected people in conversation because he did not need applause to validate policy. His discipline was not rigid for its own sake. It was adaptive within limits. When repairs could not be justified, he sold and replaced. When cash flow supported a tool, he bought it outright. When prices dipped, he cut personal spending before touching savings rates. Month after month, his method converted irregular farm income into predictable accumulation. He tracked cost per acre, worked, parts per machine hour, and fuel per bale, then compared each line against what a finance package would have forced in fixed obligations. The difference was never theoretical. It was the difference between optional expenses and mandatory payments. In farm terms, optional keeps you alive when weather turns. By late autumn 1999, with the wind pushing dust across harvested stubble, the Farmall that had been laughed at for dead metal was pulling real weight in a working plan, and Russell's envelopes had become accounts with momentum. He still looked like a man one bad season from quitting. The ledger said he was becoming a man one bad season could not easily break. The next morning, Russell parked the 1981 Chevrolet at the Huron Cooperative scale, with frost still whitening the hood and a new crack spreading across the windshield from the lower passenger corner. The odometer read 318,447 miles. The truck idled rough for 12 seconds before settling. He stepped out in a brown coat patched at both cuffs, denim darkened by chain grease near the left thigh, and boots that had been resoled once with stitch lines visible around both toes. Inside the scale office, grain tickets were stacked under a ceramic coffee mug, and two younger operators in clean, insulated bibs were talking about prepay discounts on new equipment. Glenn Tabor was there for the same reason he was everywhere that season, leaning on a counter, handing out glossy financing sheets, printed in blue and silver. His pickup outside had dealer plates, chrome mirrors, and tires that still carried the molding ridges. He watched Russell set 3 checks on the counter, then looked at the truck through the window and smiled in that measured way that sounded polite until the words landed. "You are still running that Chevrolet," Glenn said. "I can put you in a package today that gives you reliability and scale. 5% down. First-year blended payment at $13,776. You are paying almost that now in repairs and lost time." Russell did not match the tone. "What is year 3 at 9.1? Glenn shifted the sheet. "Depends on index movement. Show worst case." The number was printed in smaller text near the bottom, $1,942 monthly if rates reset at the upper collar. Annual obligation, $23,304 before fuel, seed, fertilizer, or rent. Russell looked at it for a long second, then folded his grain settlement slip and asked the clerk to deposit $8,460 into his money market account and $1,410 into checking. No speech. No drama. Glenn exhaled and tapped the paper once with a pen. "You cannot build a real operation scared of leverage." Russell answered with 6 words. "I am scared of fixed payments." That exchange looked minor to everyone in the room except the bookkeeper behind the desk, who had seen enough renewals to recognize the underlying arithmetic. Russell left with a receipt tucked in his wallet and drove home at 45 miles per hour because the right front wheel bearing had a faint hum, and he still had not priced a replacement hub. Over the weeks that followed, people in 3 townships had fully sorted him into a category: hardworking, honest, likely undercapitalized, probably temporary. The label fit his clothes, his truck, and his equipment paint. It did not fit his history. Russell was not born suspicious of debt. He was born into a family that used debt the way most farm families did, cautiously at first, and then increasingly as margins thinned. His father, Dean Ford, rented 280 acres on a crop share split through the late 1980s and took a $46,000 machinery note in 1989 at 9.6% to replace a failing combine and 2 implements that had become seasonal bottlenecks. The monthly payment was $598. In a normal year, that payment was manageable. In 2 weak years plus 1 hail year, it became structural pressure. Dean covered one season by rolling operating costs into the next and renewed at 10.1%. Then diesel climbed, local basis widened, and one landlord sold to an outside buyer who raised rent from $62 to $81 per acre in one step. None of those shocks were dramatic alone. Together, they compressed cash flow until every month was triage. The family never reached foreclosure, but the near miss shaped Russell harder than lectures ever could. In February 1993, he watched Dean and his mother at the kitchen table, with receipts spread in rows, deciding whether to delay crop insurance, delay property tax on the house lot, or delay a machinery payment and pay late fees. Dean circled 3 numbers on a yellow pad. Expected spring input cost $21,840, carryover debt service $14,372, household baseline $9,100. Then he drew one line under all 3 and wrote total obligations $45,312 before a single bushel existed. Russell was 15 and saw his father set down the pencil, stand up and go outside for 20 minutes in wind that burned the face. The lesson was not that his father failed. His father did not fail. The lesson was that fixed obligations arrive regardless of weather, and the weather never signs your note. Ed Bjerke gave that fear structure. He did not preach no debt as ideology. He framed it as survival geometry. If a machine produced enough margin to buy itself quickly, buy it. If not, rent around it, hire custom work, or run older iron and carry a parts budget. He once showed Russell 2 ledger pages from 1991. On one page, he had penciled the cost of financing a newer planter over 7 years at 8.9%. Total paid $41,776. On the other page, he listed repairs on his older planter over 7 years. Total $9,384 plus 2 days of missed planting in a wet spring. I bought delay, Ed said. I did not buy a bank partner. Russell took that principle and sharpened it. At 17, he started what he called the burden ratio, though he never used the term in conversation. He divided fixed annual obligations by conservative gross revenue. His self-imposed ceiling was 35%. If fixed commitments crossed that line, he did not add any new payment. In 1997, his fixed obligations were minimal. Rent and insurance mainly under $3,000. In 1998, with side work rising, he could have financed a newer tractor and still told himself the first-year numbers looked fine. Under stress assumptions, his burden ratio would have jumped over 50%. He declined. He also tracked replacement reserve per machine hour, a line item many operators ignored until failure forced emergency borrowing. For the Farmall, he set $3.40 per hour into reserve. For the John Deere 4430, $6.10 per hour, because parts were pricier and repair events larger. In 1999, he logged 612 engine hours between both tractors and moved $2,943 into dedicated repair savings. That money paid for a hydraulic pump rebuild, 2 rear tires bought used but sound, and a clutch job done in his own shed with borrowed splitting stands. He finished the year with both tractors operational and no payment book. If you want to know who was right about risk and who was right about image, stay with this story through the courthouse auction years, because the answer comes from ledger lines, not opinions. As cold weather work settled in, Russell turned his envelope system into 4 accounts at Prairie State Bank: operating, living, reserve, and land. The bank paid 4.1% on money market balances above $10,000. He made the threshold and kept climbing. He received winter custom feeding income of $3,260 and snow removal income of $1,180, then allocated exactly $2,664 to land savings, $1,332 to reserve, and $444 to living according to his standing percentages after direct fuel costs. He kept a separate envelope for church and family gifts and treated it as non-negotiable, because he believed discipline without generosity becomes fear wearing respectable clothes. His living plan looked stark on paper, but it was not deprivation, it was design. Annual housing contribution to his aunt remained $1,800. Food budget increased to $1,620 because he added eggs, produce, and coffee not bought in bulk. Fuel and vehicle maintenance were capped at $1,340 with one hard rule: repairs before appearance. Clothing was $420. Insurance, tags, and license fees were $670. Total baseline living costs for $5,850. Even in low-income months, that target held. He bought tools the same way he bought machinery, at discount and with intent. A torque wrench at farm auction, $35. A used air compressor with a slow leak, $90. Bearing puller set, $22. Timing light, $18. Shop manual bundle, $40. Total, $205 for items that reduced outside labor bills by several $1,000s over the next 3 seasons. He wrote each purchase under a column labeled Capability, because for him tools were not consumption, they were cash flow insulation. Then came the first real test of his system, with lease negotiations on additional ground. A retiring operator offered 120 acres of mixed productivity ground at $38 per acre, cash rent, 1-year term, tenant responsible for fertilizer and weed control. Total rent was $4,560 due in 2 installments, March and November. Russell had the full amount in land account cash and paid the March half, $2,280, with a cashier's check. He prepaid only the fertilizer he could store safely, negotiated seed by volume with 2 neighbors, and budgeted total direct crop input at $16,740 under conservative yield assumptions. At 118 bushels per acre, corn and $2.12 cash price, gross revenue projection was thin but workable. At 132 bushels and $2.28, he would have room to add to reserve. Glenn crossed his path again at an implement lot south of town, where Russell was inspecting a cultivator with worn sweeps and straight frame rails. Glenn was cordial, even patient, but still sure of his model. He pointed at a line of newer tractors and said financing offered speed, tax advantages, and status with landlords. Russell nodded, asked for the asking price on the cultivator, and bought it for $640 cash after confirming the lift cylinders held pressure. He loaded it behind the old Chevrolet, ratchet-strapped the tongue twice, and drove home without saying another word. In the maintenance stretch before field work, he ran nights in the shed with a discipline that looked tedious to anyone measuring life by novelty. Differential oil samples checked, grease points marked with paint pen, fuel filters changed by engine hour schedule, not by memory, tire pressures logged weekly because underinflation was hidden expense. He tracked all of it. Parts and consumables for preseason prep, $786, avoided dealer service estimate for comparable work, $2,940. Difference, $2,154 kept liquid. When fieldwork opened, the appearance gap had widened. Russell still looked like the poorest man in line at the elevator, and his equipment still carried faded paint and welded history. Yet beneath that exterior sat a structure with almost no fragility. $29,700 in money market, $22,000 plus in combined operating and reserve balances after lease and input commitments. No variable rate note, no equipment line, no obligation that could reset upward in a bad year. The old Farmall that cost $150 and $486 in parts was not just running. It had become the first brick in a system built to survive long enough to accumulate what others had to sell. He treated that realization as instruction, not triumph, and started turning survival into repeatable accumulation, one crop year at a time. In March 2000, he planted the leased 120 acres with input costs that came in at $16,412 instead of the $16,740 he had budgeted, because he bought nitrogen in 2 tranches and caught a lower local, quote, by prepaying in cash. Harvest yields averaged 124 bushels per acre on corn. Cash price averaged $2.19 per bushel, and gross crop revenue from that tract came to $32,582 before trucking adjustments. After rent, inputs, fuel, repairs, and drying, he cleared $9,140 on the lease and another $6,880 net from custom work. Total net for 2000 was $16,020. He moved $9,612 into land savings, $4,806 into reserve, and $1,602 into living, then still finished the year with his baseline costs under $6,000. By the second week of January 2001, he had a legal pad devoted only to avoided obligations. If he had signed Glenn's package in 1999, fixed equipment payments for 2000 and 2001 would have totaled $27,552 before any reset. Instead, he had paid cash for repairs and used implements totaling $4,177 over those same 2 years. Avoided fixed outflow, $23,375. He added that line to his money market history and treated the difference as earned margin. In 2001, he leased another 80 acres at $41 per acre, bringing operated ground to 200 leased acres plus custom acres. Net crop income that year was $22,460, almost exactly where his conservative forecast had pointed, and living expenses were held to $11,280, even after he replaced the Chevrolet's fuel pump, brake lines, and front-wheel hub. The truck looked worse and ran better. Then came a ledger stretch that local bankers later photocopied for young borrowers because it showed how patience compounds when fixed payments stay low. 2002. Operated 260 acres total through short leases. Gross farm and custom revenue $118,340. Total operating and maintenance expense $82,910. Net $35,430. Added $21,258 to land account. Reserve balance closed at $54,880. 2003. Bought 80 acres from widow Lorna Kensett for $64,000 cash, plus $1,140 title and filing costs. No lien recorded. Planted 310 operated acres, including leased ground. Net farm income $41,770. End-year cash and reserve balances combined, $119,460. 2004. Corn average price softened, but he sold in 4 increments and held basis risk down. Net income, $33,210. Spent $6,420 on drainage work and fence repair on the new 80 acres, increasing lease value of adjacent ground. Land account at year-end, $91,300 after improvements. 2005. Purchased 160 acres at $1,050 per acre, total $168,000 cash, from brothers settling an estate west of Woolsey. Closing cost $2,960. No borrowed dollar. Operated 540 acres between owned and leased tracts. Net income $57,840 despite higher fuel. 2006. Bought contiguous 70 acres from the Carlson family for $67,200 cash, bringing paid-for land to 310 acres. Spent $14,300 on lime and tile rather than paint or cab upgrades. Net income $49,110. Reserve account closed at $97,740. 2007. Total paid for land valued locally around $496,000 using conservative comparable sales. Combined liquid balances $211,300 after all expenses and capital improvements. Debt service, 0. That was the arithmetic spine. The daily life around it remained plain enough that people kept missing what was happening. Russell still walked into supply counters in sun-faded caps and jackets with stitched elbows. He still bought lunch meat on sale and brewed coffee at home. He still drove the same 1981 Chevrolet, now past 360,000 miles, with primer over another rust repair and a tailgate chain replaced by one from a scrap bin. At the elevator, he was reliable, but visually unremarkable. In the ledger, he had become one of the fastest accumulators in the county. Glenn did not stop pressing him. In late 2005, after the 160-acre purchase recorded at the courthouse, Glenn met him near the parts counter and tried a different angle. You have land now? Land equity should be leveraged. You could step into a late-model combine at favorable terms and harvest faster. Russell looked at a gasket catalog, then answered in one sentence, 48 words, the longest he had spoken to Glenn in months. Faster is useful if the speed creates margin after all costs, but speed on a note is just a bigger monthly promise, and I do not make promises weather can break. By harvest 2006, the county had split into 2 philosophies, neither made of bad people. One group believed strongly in scaling with modern financed equipment, bigger lineups, and more acres under management, accepting debt as the cost of staying competitive. The other group was smaller and less vocal, prioritizing low fixed obligations, used machinery, and cash reserves. Russell was the most visible example of the second group, mostly because his appearance made the contrast so stark. Tyler Meeks represented the first approach with skill and good intent. He was organized, respected, and hardworking, and he had expanded at the same time. Lenders encouraged expansion. Between 2002 and 2006, Tyler financed $412,000 in machinery and storage upgrades, with blended variable terms tied to a one-year index plus margin. Initial total monthly obligations sat near $3,980. At commodity prices above his planning assumptions, those payments looked manageable. Then rates adjusted and renewals repriced. By 2008, his monthly debt load rose to $6,140, and annual fixed debt service moved above $73,000 before labor and inputs. Tyler was not careless. He was exposed. Donna Halverson and her brother Ray carried a similar burden from another direction. Their family had worked 640 acres for years and refinanced at 7.1% to consolidate notes, improve bins, and lock in what seemed like a practical structure. The problem came when a dry cycle cut yields, and their renewal terms were offered at 10.4% with tighter collateral language. Their annual interest expense alone rose by roughly $24,900. The math squeezed slowly, then all at once. They sold machinery first, then reduced rented acres, trying to hold the core home section. Luis Ortega made his bet in hogs, expanding with a $285,000 barn and equipment debt package on projections that assumed stable feed costs and stronger hog prices. He built cleanly, managed carefully, and worked long days. When feed spiked and market prices softened, his margins inverted for 3 consecutive quarters. Losses were not dramatic on one statement, but they stacked. He covered one round with savings, one with a short operating line, and then hit the ceiling. Let me stop here and ask you something. When numbers are tight and everyone around you says bigger is safer, would you choose appearance and speed, or would you choose flexibility and silence? That choice is the fulcrum of this entire story. The market answered in 2008 with no sentiment at all. Input costs rose hard. Nitrogen invoices that had been difficult became punishing. Fuel climbed. Corn slipped under key break-even assumptions for heavily financed operators. Lenders, facing their own risk controls, tightened credit standards and demanded higher equity positions for renewals. On paper, those were policy adjustments. On farms, they were life changes. 3 days into July of 2008, Tyler sat with his lender and tried to restructure across a longer amortization horizon. The bank offered partial relief with additional collateral and mandatory equipment liquidation. He sold 2 newer units and still could not get fixed obligations below sustainable levels given his updated yield and price assumptions. By spring 2009, he lost control of his operation. Machinery auction, leases gone. He kept his integrity, took a manager role later, and rebuilt his life, but the original operation was gone. Donna and Ray fought longer because they had family ground and deep community support. In 2008 and 2009, they cut household spending, renegotiated supplier terms, and hired out some field work rather than carry labor costs. Drought conditions reduced yield enough that even disciplined cuts could not close the gap against rising financing costs. They sold 1/4 to satisfy renewal terms and retained reduced acres. No one who watched them work could claim they lacked discipline. They were trapped by timing and rate structure. Louis shut down the expanded hog phase in 2009 after running negative margins too long. He liquidated equipment to settle as much debt as possible and protected his family home by moving quickly before penalties stacked further. He later said the decision felt like admitting failure, though in truth it was a controlled retreat from an untenable model. Russell entered that same period with no lender to satisfy and no variable note to reset. His operating decisions were still hard, but they were optional hard, not contractual hard. He reduced leased acreage bids when rent no longer penciled. He paid cash for seed and fertilizer in staged purchases instead of financing inventory at retail terms. He deferred non-critical machinery upgrades and redirected funds to reserve and land opportunities. In 2008, his net income dipped, but remained positive at $44,980. In 2009, one of his leanest years operationally, he still posted $31,640 net and added to cash balances rather than drawing them down. By October 2010, local records and bank statements told a blunt story. Russell's total cash reserves reached $286,000. Debt remained zero. Paid for land remained fully unencumbered. He was still parking outside the same elevator, still stepping out in worn denim and repaired boots, still hearing the occasional old label, the poor Ford boy, from people who had not looked past the truck. But the underlying reality had fully separated from the appearance. Around him, fixed payments had forced good farmers to sell under pressure. Around him, rates and drought had exposed every fragile line item. Around him, polished machinery had turned into auction lots. He kept one policy unchanged through that entire stretch: never use someone else's loss as personal proof. When Tyler took the cooperative grain management job in 2010, Russell delivered a rebuilt auger motor to the site and refused payment. When Donna and Ray downsized, he shared seed contacts and timing notes without commentary. When Luis started taking repair work in Mitchell, Russell sent 2 tractor owners to his shop and paid invoices the day they were issued. He did not call it charity. He called it staying decent. And while the county argued about strategy, he kept running the same quiet equation: low fixed burden plus patient cash flow plus contiguous land purchases when forced sellers needed fast closing. That was the equation that would carry him into the funeral in 2011, where one request would move him from disciplined accumulator to something the county had not expected to see. That request came at the fellowship meal after Ed Bjork's funeral, with folding chairs scraping against the church basement floor and casserole dishes cooling along the wall. Ed's daughter, Ingrid, waited until most people had left, then placed a manila folder beside Russell's coffee cup. Inside were parcel maps and a draft letter from her family attorney. 240 acres adjoining Russell's ground. Price set at $1,320 per acre. If closed within 30 days, total $316,800. She did not make it sentimental. If this goes to outside investors, they will split it. We will lose the field lines Dad kept intact. Russell looked at the map, traced the drainage run with one finger, and asked one question. Clear title? Ingrid nodded. No disputes. Taxes current. He said, I can close. By the first week of April 2011, he sat across from a banker who had always treated him respectfully, but never fully grasped his liquidity. Russell requested a cashier's check for $316,800 from the land account and another transfer schedule for $18,000 in post-close tile and fencing works. The banker reviewed the balance twice, then once more after pulling a second monitor from sleep. Russell's available cash after the check still exceeded $190,000 across operating and reserve accounts. No pledged collateral, no bridge note, no lien filing. The banker asked whether he wanted to leverage the purchase for tax positioning. Russell said, "No debt. Record it clean." News moved quietly first, then fast. Courthouse filings are public in a small county, and by planning season, local lenders, appraisers, and land managers had recalibrated their view of him. He still showed up in patched coats, still drove the old Chevrolet, still brought his own thermos to meetings, but small operator no longer fit the arithmetic. He had become something harder to classify, a farmer who looked cash poor and moved like private capital. Glenn Tabor did not change his argument. At an equipment open house in 2012, he told a cluster of producers that borrowing against appreciating land was how modern operators became untouchable. Russell, standing near a parts display with hydraulic couplers in his hand, answered in 11 words. Untouchable means no one can call your note in a drought. By late September 2014, Russell had added only what penciled under stress assumptions. He bought one used grain cart for $12,400 cash, rebuilt an older header trailer for $1,180 in steel and lights, and put $27,600 into drainage and windbreak work instead of upgrading to newer paint. His acres increased gradually through cash leases, but his central play remained unchanged. Preserve optionality, then strike when forced sales created mispricing. The public reveal came 7 years after Ed's funeral, in a courthouse hallway in Watertown, on a gray morning in February 2018. 3 foreclosure cases had pooled into one auctions block, totaling 1,120 acres. Corn was under $3.40 per bushel. Lenders were requiring larger equity cushions. Several bidding groups arrived expecting to finance, then slowed when terms tightened the night before. Russell came in worn denim, mud-caked boots, and that same Chevrolet, now at 421,000 miles, with a replacement mirror held by 2 non-matching bolts. People who did not know him assumed he was there to watch. He signed in, handed the clerk proof of funds letters from Prairie State Bank and Dakota Plains Bank totaling $280,000, and took a seat near the back wall. The room shifted without anyone saying so directly. 2 attorneys asked to see the letters again. The auction clerk verified both banks by phone. Glenn stood 10 feet away, expression fixed somewhere between surprise and recognition, because many of the packages unraveling that day had originated in his showroom years earlier. Bidding opened high, stalled, then restarted in narrower increments. Financed groups hesitated whenever their advisors stepped in from the hallway with revised requirements. Russell did not bid often. When he did, he moved in exact jumps, never emotional, never rushed. At $2,744 per acre on the core block, the room went quiet long enough for the clerk's pen to hover before final call. Sold. Russell supplemented the verified letters with $93,280 transferred from his settlement account to complete total closing requirements, then closed in 14 days with no debt instrument recorded. That was the number the county remembered. $2,744 per acre. Cash close, 1,120 acres added in one cycle. His paid-for total, rose to 1,670 acres. There was no note to refinance, no variable rate to reset, no lender covenant to satisfy when weather or markets turned. A regional reporter caught Glenn in the hallway afterward and asked for comment. Glenn gave it plainly without sarcasm. I spent 20 years telling him to borrow more. He beat us with cash flow discipline. It was the most accurate sentence he ever gave on record about Russell Ford. Russell treated the auction as a responsibility, not a finish line. He had watched too many good families lose control of timing, and he had no interest in becoming a private lender who extracted from desperation. In July 2018, he formed the Ford Operating Fund with an initial capital deposit of $1,200,000, drafted by local council with terms simple enough to enforce and humane enough to work. 0% interest. 5-year term. Individual cap of $75,000. Mandatory quarterly cash flow reviews. Repayment triggered only after a profitable harvest year, as defined in the sign worksheet. The first 3 recipients were not random applications. They were people tied to families hit hardest in the previous cycle. Maren Meeks, Tyler's daughter, received $72,000 in 2 tranches. The first $44,000 covered a used planter and early input costs on 190 leased acres. The second, $28,000, released after first quarter review, covered fuel and in-season fertility when spring prices moved. Her worksheet required living expenses under $2,400 monthly and a minimum reserve transfer of 12% of gross sales. In year 1, weather cut yields and she posted only a thin positive margin. No payment due. In year 2, with better yield and stronger basis timing, she netted $38,700 and repaid $15,000. By the end of year 4, she had repaid the full $72,000 and held $49,300 in reserves. Cole Halverson, Ray's son, took the full $75,000 cap to secure a 3-year lease block and avoid high-rate operating credit. Russell added one condition specific to Cole: no machinery purchase above $9,000 without written cost per acre comparison against custom hire options. Cole accepted. The rule saved him from financing a late model sprayer he hired application on contract at lower all-in cost and preserved liquidity. He repaid $18,000 after his first profitable soybean cycle, $21,000 the next year, and cleared the remaining balance in year 5 with 6 months to spare. Daniel Ortega, Luis's nephew, did not start with acreage ambitions. He started with repair and custom support work, where he already had skill. Russell funded $54,000 for a service truck, tooling, and inventory so Daniel could cover in-season breakdowns across 2 counties. The contract required quarterly receivables aging reports because service businesses fail from slow collections as often as from lack of jobs. Daniel followed the system, hit cash flow break-even in 9 months, and repaid in full by year 3. He then hired 2 technicians and began servicing planters and older tractors that younger farmers could not afford to replace. Donna Halverson's case carried more history. She had fought to keep family ground through the hardest years, then watched adjacent acreage move beyond reach. In 2019, Russell sold her 80 acres at his own cost basis from the Bjerke transaction, $1,320 per acre, total $105,600. When comparable market bids were near $2,050 per acre, or $164,000. Effective discount, $58,400. He financed internally at 0% over 10 annual payments of $10,500 $560, with an option to defer one payment in declared drought years. She used that clause once in 2021, then resumed and remained current. He also spent $48,000 on 2 used tractors, a John Deere 4440 and an International 1086, reconditioned both through Luis's shop network and placed them with beginning operators under the same short phrase Ed had once used with him: "Pay me when you can." Contracts were written. Maintenance logs were mandatory. Default triggered equipment return, not penalties. By year 4, repayment compliance on those placements was 100%. 3 harvests later, the impact was measurable beyond individual stories. The fund had issued $486,000 across 7 loans, received $486,000 back, and revolved the same dollars into new recipients without charging interest. Aggregate delinquency, 0. Combined acres operated by recipients and their immediate partnerships rose from 190 at entry to 1,460 by 2022. One disciplined balance sheet had become a local ownership multiplier. The deeper examination that proved his philosophy was not rhetorical. It was line-item arithmetic over 21 years. From 1997 through 2018, Russell paid approximately $5,147,000 for land acquisitions and major improvements, all cash at closing. Over the same span, modeled financing at average blended rates common in his county would have added an estimated $1,836,000 in interest expense, assuming no default and no penalty repricing. He did not claim moral superiority from avoiding that cost. He treated it as avoided drag. Money not paid to interest became reserves, flexibility, and later other families' opportunities. His own year-by-year post-funeral sequence looked like this. 2011, bought 240 acres for $316,800 cash. Improvements, $18,000. End-year reserves, $202,400. 2012. Net farm income, $63,900. Capital repairs, $21,300. Reserve closed $244,700. 2013. Added 90 leased acres at $154 per acre. Seasonal cash rent, $13,860 paid. End-year reserve, $231,500. 2014, net income, $71,200. Land improvements, $27,600. Reserve close, $268,900. 2015, added 120 leased acres at $188 per acre, seasonal cash rent, $22,560 paid. Reserve closed $219,400. 2016, net income $84,300. No land purchase. Reserve closed $301,100. 2017, net income $79,800. Set aside courthouse liquidity bucket $2,100,000 across 2 banks and treasuries. 2018, bought 1,120 acres at $2,700 $44 per acre. Total $3,073,280. Closed with cash positions assembled from prior reserves, treasury ladder maturities, and active operating balances. No debt filed. At age 40, his net worth estimate near year-end 2018 sat around $6,400,000 using conservative land values and verified cash balances after the fund allocation. He still lived in the same modest farmhouse. He still drove old vehicles. he still discussed soil tests more than asset values. The prevailing consensus had said leverage was the only path to scale. Russell's path was slower, less visible, and far less fragile. He had not merely protected himself from losing ground. He had built a structure that let other families step back into ownership without walking into the same trap. That structure began proving itself within one full cycle of quarterly reviews, because Russell did not confuse kindness with loose management. Marin Meeks brought her first-year packet to his kitchen table in October 2019. Every fuel receipt taped to ledger paper, every input invoice matched against field-by-field yield. Her gross revenue on 190 leased acres was $146,820. Direct operating costs were $108,440. Lease expense was $29,640. Net margin was $8,740, too thin to trigger repayment under the fund rules, so her required payment remained zero and her reserve transfer stayed mandatory at 12% of gross, $17,618. In 2020, with stronger yield and cleaner timing on sales, her gross climbed to $201,360 and net reached $38,700. She paid back $15,000 exactly as contracted. By 2022, she had repaid all $72,000, held $49,300 in cash reserves, and signed a contract for deed on 60 acres at $2,180 per acre with 35% down, no variable note. By 2024, she operated 420 acres total, 60 owned and 360 leased, and her fixed obligation ratio stayed under 29%, below Russell's old threshold. Cole Halverson's trajectory was slower, but just as disciplined. His first 2 seasons under the $75,000 zero-interest loan were not spectacular in yield, yet his cost structure stayed stable because he followed the no large purchase rule and hired spraying and some harvest passes instead of financing equipment pride. In 2020, he posted gross receipts of $183,440 and netted $24,110 after all costs, then paid $18,000 on principal. In 2021, a dry stretch reduced output, and he used the review system exactly as designed, cutting discretionary spending, deferring one non-critical shed upgrade, and preserving repair reserve. By 2023, he had fully repaid the fund, then leased 240 acres under a 3-year term with rent escalators capped in writing. In 2025, he and Ray together still farmed reduced family ground plus leases, smaller than the old Halverson footprint, but finally stable, with no annual rate reset anxiety hanging over winter planning. Daniel Ortega turned the smallest initial footprint into the fastest cash cycle. The $54,000 he received in 2018 was split with precision. $21,500 for a service truck, $17,200 for tooling and diagnostics, $9,800 for rolling parts inventory, and $5,500 for working capital. Russell required quarterly receivables aging reports, and that one rule kept Daniel out of the trap that closes many repair businesses. He refused to let unpaid invoices drift beyond 60 days without a plan. By mid-2021, he had repaid the full principal, added 2 technicians, and moved to a larger Mitchell shop with annual gross sales above $640,000 and net operating margin near 14%. Luis Ortega, who had once absorbed the collapse of his hog expansion, now ran that shop floor as operations lead, salary plus profit share, and called it the first business arrangement that let him sleep in January. Donna Halverson's 80-acre repurchase at $1,320 per acre became one of the fund's most cited examples because it was measured generosity, not symbolic generosity. Market bids near that period were roughly $2,050 per acre, so her effective entry discount remained $58,400. Her internal 0% payment schedule of $10,560 annually was difficult but possible. She deferred once during the 2021 drought declaration, exactly as allowed, resumed in 2022, and by the end of 2028 she paid in full and recorded clear title. That one parcel produced enough income stability that Ray could stop chasing fragile expansion leases and focus on efficient core acres. They never returned to 640 acres. They returned to control. By the second week of November 2022, the Ford Operating Fund had issued $486,000, been repaid $486,000, and revolved principal into 4 additional beginning operators screened under the same quarterly review rules. Russell kept the recipient list private, but county totals were not private. The combined recipient group operated 1,460 acres by 2022 and 2,340 acres by 2025, with average debt service ratios materially lower than county peers in similar age brackets. Conservative land valuation at $2,900 average per acre for owned portions put recipient-owned ground near $3,132,000. Add equipment equity and cash reserves, and the cohort's combined net worth crossed $4,400,000. The multiplier was no slogan. It was arithmetic. If you are learning something from this part of the story, press like and share it with one person who still believes debt is the only path to scale. Because this ledger proves a second path exists. Glenn Tabor's resolution came without drama and without public self-defense. After the 2018 courthouse auction quote circulated, he remained at the dealership through 2022, but his sales mix changed in plain view. He started building used equipment packages with transparent repair histories and stress-tested payment scenarios at higher interest assumptions instead of optimistic ones. Younger sales staff noticed he stopped saying scale or die and started saying survive first, scale second. In his final full sales year, 2021, more than half of his contracts were for late-model used tractors and combines priced 40 to 55% below new inventory, and he pushed fixed-rate terms whenever customers qualified. At retirement in 2022, Glenn spoke at a regional dealer meeting and made one statement that matched the facts. He said he had spent too many years equating borrowing capacity with business strength, and that several disciplined cash operators had outlasted better-looking balance sheets. He did not turn into a saint, and he did not become Russell's close friend. He became accurate. In retirement, he consulted part-time for 2 independent lots, helping them create disclosure sheets that compared true 5-year ownership costs across new financed units versus used cash purchases plus repairs. The irony held, but without bitterness. The man who once laughed at a dead Farmall finished his career teaching buyers to respect old equipment and lower fixed burdens. Roll call in this story mattered, because loose ends are expensive in finance and in memory. Tyler Meeks, who lost his original operation in the rate reset years, stayed at the cooperative grain site, moved from manager to regional operations director by 2026, and mentored younger producers on basis risk and storage timing. He never regained his old acreage personally, But he helped Marin build hers, and he said that was enough. Marin remained current on every obligation and had zero delinquent payments across all her contracts by 2027. Cole Halverson and Ray Halverson continued farming reduced acres with lower stress and stronger reserves. Donna, after final payment on her 80 acres, placed part of that ground into a family transfer plan with clear conditions: no variable rate borrowing above a set ceiling, without unanimous review. Luis and Daniel Ortega expanded the Mitchell repair business to 3 service trucks and 5 full-time technicians, profitable every year after 2021. Ingrid Bjerke, who had asked Russell for the 30-day close after Ed's funeral, used sale proceeds to settle family obligations and set up a conservation lease on a small non-crop parcel her family retained. She said later that keeping Ed's old field lines intact mattered more than squeezing top dollar from outside buyers. Lorna Kensett, the widow who sold Russell 80 acres in 2003 for $64,000 cash, passed away peacefully in 2016. Her nieces received the remainder of her estate without dispute and still send holiday cards to Russell's house. Harold Vane, whose 1992 auction became one of Russell's formative lessons, spent his later years doing seasonal mechanic work, never returned to owning 320 acres, but retired in 2011 with his home paid and no consumer debt. Dean Ford, Russell's father, saw the model work in full before his own death in 2020 and told neighbors his son had built room to breathe into every acre. Russell himself kept the same visual profile that had invited misjudgment since 1997. The old Chevrolet was finally retired from daily field duty after 437,902 miles and parked in a machine shed bay, still running, used for short trips on dry days. His regular pickup became a used 2006 3/4 ton, bought in cash, no chrome package, no vanity upgrades. The Farmall M remained operational and ran at local threshing demonstrations twice each summer, not as nostalgia theater, but as a working reminder that capital efficiency often starts with repair skill. His annual personal living costs, even with inflation, stayed modest relative to asset position, generally between $34,000 and $42,000 through the mid-2020s, because he still separated wants from obligations. The paperwork matched the philosophy. All fund notes, repayment ledgers, and quarterly worksheets were digitized and stored through local counsel with annual independent review. Nothing informal was left to memory. He converted the private fund into a durable legal structure in 2024 with a permanent capital base of $1,800,000, still zero interest, still tied to profitable harvest triggers, still capped per recipient to prevent concentration risk. By 2028, cumulative loans issued since inception reached $1,965,000 through revolving reuse of principal, and cumulative principal repaid reached $1,734,000, with the remainder performing on schedule. No one was chased. No one was humiliated. Terms were strict, clear, and survivable. Before we close, subscribe if you want more true farm ledgers like this one, because stories like Russell Ford's are usually hidden in plain sight behind worn paint and quiet habits. Then comment with one specific number from this story that changed how you think about risk, whether it is the $150 Farmall, the $316,800 funeral week close, or the $58,400 discount that put Donna back on her ground. Finally, share this with one producer in your circle who is carrying a payment load that leaves no weather margin, because this is not anti-growth, it is pro-survival first. The final image is still South Dakota, still practical, still understated. A modest farmhouse, patched coats on hooks by the back door, ledger pages stacked beside soil maps, an old Farmall ticking down after a short run, and fields that cannot be called by any lender because no note exists to call. Appearance said poor for decades, arithmetic said free. In the end, freedom fed more than one family. By the first Monday of February 2029, the long oak table in Russell's farmhouse kitchen held three things that had followed him since 19. The original school notebook with the $150 Farmall entry, a stack of current fund ledgers printed for audit, and Donna Halverson's recorded clear title packet for the 80 acres she had bought back at cost and finished repaying in 2028. The notebook stayed in a clear sleeve now, pages brittle at the edges, but every number remained legible. Marin sat on Russell's left with her quarterly packet open to a debt service worksheet. Cole sat across from her with lease maps and input bids. Daniel arrived last from Mitchell in work coveralls with a clean collar, carrying receivables, aging reports exactly as required. Russell did not make speeches. He checked columns, asked for gross, net, reserve transfer, and fixed obligation ratio. Marin reported 2028 gross revenue of $412,600, net of $86,240, reserve balance of $118,900, and fixed obligations at 27.4%. Cole reported gross of $336,140, net of $61,880, reserve at $74,300, ratio at 31.1%. Daniel reported shop gross of $912,000, net operating margin 15.2%, no delinquent invoice beyond 60 days, and zero term debt on equipment. Russell nodded once after each report and wrote one line beside each name: stable, disciplined, repeatable. 3 days later, they met again at Prairie State Bank for what looked small from the hallway and large from any ledger perspective. The Ford Operating Fund Committee approved 4 new zero-interest notes totaling $242,000, financed entirely by recycled principal and retained earnings on conservative cash instruments, not by outside borrowing. Daniel co-signed one as Mentor Capital, his first time on the giving side. That was the cascade Russell had always wanted, recipients becoming capital providers without adopting predatory terms. The arithmetic by that meeting was clear. Since 2018, cumulative loans issued had reached $2,207,000. Principal repaid on schedule stood at $1,976,000. Active notes were current, with no charge-offs and no penalty interest, because there was never any interest to penalize. County Extension staff, who once promoted package leverage as default strategy, asked permission to anonymize the model for a risk management workshop. Russell approved with one condition: show the living budgets too, not only acres. By late April, the Mitchell repair shop ran 3 bays past dusk, and Luis Ortega stood under white task lights, watching a young technician torque a head bolt sequence on an older Deere block. Daniel handed Luis the month-end summary. Labor revenue, $61,400. Parts margin, $18,200. Overhead, $52,300. Net before owner, draw $27,300. Luis tapped the page with one grease-darkened finger and smiled in that restrained way he had when relief was real and not performative. He took off his glasses, looked at Daniel, and said, "We lost one business because we ran faster than cash. We kept this one because we count before we promise." On the wall behind them hung a framed copy of Daniel's paid-in-full receipt from the fund, next to a second frame holding the first invoice Russell ever sent to the shop and paid same day. Before closing that evening, Daniel transferred $12,000 into a new apprentice tool grant account and set the contract language himself. 0%, quarterly check-ins, repay only after profitable quarters. Multiplier effect, now operational and local. In June, Donna and Ray came to the same kitchen table where they had once reviewed drought deferral terms. This time, Donna set down certified copies of the 2028 satisfaction filing and clear title record for the 80 acres, along with the family planning binder she wanted Russell to review. Russell slid an updated documentation packet across the table with county reference pages already tabbed. Ray read the legal description twice, then folded the packet slowly and placed his palm flat on top of it. He did not cry. He exhaled as if setting down weight carried for years. Donna looked at Russell and said, "You sold it at your number, not the market number. We remember." Russell answered with 5 words. "Use it to anchor family." They finalized a family transfer framework that capped variable rate exposure and required unanimous review before any major debt move. A painful thread in Halverson history closed with paper, signatures, and enforceable terms. By the harvest moon of 2029, Glenn Tabor's final resolution arrived in a machine shed that still smelled like gear oil and dry dust. He had retired 7 years earlier, but he drove out in a used half-ton and asked if he could see the Farmall run. Russell rolled it out, checked fuel, set choke, and turned it over. The old engine caught on the second pull and settled into the same steady note it had found decades before. Glenn watched without the old sales posture, hands in jacket pockets, eyes fixed on the flywheel. Then he walked to the retired 1981 Chevrolet, parked in the adjacent bay, read the handwritten tag on the dash listing 437,902 miles, and laughed once at himself quietly. "I used to think this was stubbornness," he said. "It was structure." He handed Russell an envelope containing a photocopy of his 2018 quote to the reporter and a note from his 2022 dealer speech. "I wanted you to have both statements together. Wrong first, accurate later." That loaded look he had worn in courthouse hallways years ago finally had language behind it. 2 customer defaults in 1 week during 2018 had broken his confidence in the old script, and he had not known how to admit it publicly until retirement. He left before supper, no ceremony, resolution complete. In October 2030, the Bjerke family held a conservation field day on the parcel Ingrid had retained, and every major name in this story stood on the same ground without performance. Ingrid chaired the event and confirmed the lease revenues were now funding annual soil scholarships in Ed's name. Tyler spoke briefly as Regional Operations Director for the cooperative, showing younger growers basis maps and storage timing examples that might save thin margin years. Marin arrived in a work jacket, with her own daughter's hand in hers, and parked beside Cole's serviceable grain truck. Cole and Ray discussed tile plans on reduced but stable acres. Donna brought pie and left early for chore checks. Daniel and Louise parked a service truck near the lane and fixed a combine sensor for a neighbor before lunch, then refused payment because the owner was inside his first operating year. No one called this a miracle. It was systems work over time. Every physical artifact that carried weight in Russell's story ended with a clear home and purpose. The original school notebook was scanned at archival resolution and stored in duplicate. 1 encrypted file set with the local council, 1 hard copy in a fire-rated box at Russell's house. The manila parcel folder Ingrid had handed him at Ed's funeral was added to the county deed packet and indexed under the 2011 transfer. The proof of funds letters from the 2018 courthouse auction were deposited with settlement records and later donated as redacted teaching material for farm finance classes. The old Chevrolet, after retirement from field duty, was serviced annually, started monthly, and loaned each summer to the county fair history barn where teenagers could see what 437,902 hard miles and disciplined maintenance looked like. The Farmall remained operational and was run twice each season at demonstrations. Not polished into myth, only kept functional as evidence that paid-for equipment can outlast fashion cycles. The fund notes, repayment ledgers, and quarterly worksheets were reconciled each January, independently reviewed and either renewed, closed, or archived with notation. Nothing drifted into oral tradition. Everything material was documented. By January 2032, Russell was 54, still in the same farmhouse, still wearing patched coats when the stitching held, still debt-free. His estimated net worth moved with land values and commodity cycles, but the durable point was structural. No callable note, significant liquidity, and a lending model that preserved dignity while enforcing discipline. Dean Ford had passed in 2020, proud and settled. Ed Björk had passed in 2011, but his short sentence about bank partners still circulated in local meetings. Lorna Kensett was gone, her nieces secure. Harold Vane was gone as well, remembered not for losing acres, but for mentoring mechanics in his later years. Glenn was alive in retirement, occasionally teaching ownership cost comparisons to young sales teams who asked for the version without showroom optimism. Tyler, Donna, Ray, Luis, Marin, Cole, Daniel, and Ingrid were all where the arithmetic said they could be. Not flashy, not invulnerable to weather, but operating inside margins they controlled. The thesis never needed decoration. Wealth in this county rarely announced itself with new paint. It showed up as optionality in bad years, clean title at closing, and the ability to help without creating dependency. Russell had appeared poor for most of his adult life because he prioritized function over display and reserves over applause. People saw patched denim, a rusted truck, and old iron. They did not see avoided interest expense compounding into land control, then turning into zero-interest pathways for other families. Debt had not been treated as evil in abstract terms. It had been treated as a non-trivial risk multiplier that required humility, timing, luck, and stable prices all at once. His alternative was slower and, consequently, sturdier. On a cold evening after chores, he shut the machine shed doors, hung one worn coat by the back entry, and placed the day's receipts beside soil maps on the kitchen counter. Outside, the retired Chevrolet sat under a light layer of dust, ready to start. Inside, the Farmall manual lay open to a page he had memorized years ago. Across the county, land tied to his name had no lender claim attached to it, and land tied to people he had backed was increasingly the same. Appearance had spoken first. Arithmetic had spoken last.